Welcome in, everyone, to today's deep dive. I actually want to start by just addressing you, the listener, directly for a second.
Yeah, I think it's important to set the stage here.
Right. Because if you are someone who identifies with men's rights activism, or if you actively follow the discussions happening within the manosphere, or even if you just resonate with red pill philosophies generally.
This one is definitely for you.
Exactly. This specific deep dive is custom tailored exactly for your interests. Today, we have a very clear mission.
A very heavy mission, I'd say.
Oh, absolutely. We are reviewing a highly provocative, truly polarizing and explosive new ebook.
And it essentially claims to explain the exact history, the psychology, and the mechanics of how Western institutions were systematically captured.
Captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies. And our goal today is to unpack this source material as thoroughly as possible so that you, the listener, can just decide for yourself if you want to buy it and read it.
Which is really the best way to approach a text like this.
Definitely. And speaking of which, please remember to like and subscribe to our deep dive wherever you are listening right now. We also explicitly urge you to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the ebook we are discussing today.
It's definitely making waves.
Yeah, it is. And furthermore, make sure you follow the author at Conrad N. Riker. That's at CONRADNRIKER on Substack.
But before we actually delve into the text itself, we need to firmly establish the analytical boundaries of our show today.
Yes, please, because this is going to get intense.
It really is. The source material we are examining contains highly politically charged content.
Very charged.
It is intensely anti-left-wing and intensely anti-feminist. And as your guides today, we want to be clear that we are not taking sides.
Right. We are not endorsing these viewpoints, and we're not condemning them either.
Exactly. Our job is strictly to impartially report, distill, and analyze the arguments and the data exactly as the author presents them.
You're just the messengers here.
We are here to act as objective guides to the text, breaking down the mechanics of his arguments so you can understand the architecture of his claims without any of our own external bias clouding the review.
Okay, so let's unpack this. The book is called BPD, Limerence, and Chaos. All women are on the spectrum, get bored, and blow up civilization.
Quite a title.
Yeah, just from the title,
Abstract.
you can tell the scope is massive. It was published in 2025 by Conrad Riker.
And the core premise is not shy. Riker posits that Western civilization is actively being dismantled by the unexamined, emotionally volatile nature of the modern female psyche.
And he goes even further than that. He claims that this psychology has been intentionally weaponized by far-left political frameworks to seize control of our institutions.
It's a sweeping theory of civilizational decline. He is essentially attempting to connect evolutionary psychology, macroeconomics, endocrinology, and cultural Marxism into one unified narrative.
Which is a huge undertaking. Where does he even start?
To begin understanding this architecture, we really have to look at what Riker considers the blueprint of institutional capture.
Okay, this is the exact intersection where he believes classical Marxism meets what he terms the maternal instinct.
You know, I was really struck by the analogy he uses to open this argument, because he writes that every ideology has a specific smell.
Right, the smell test.
Yeah, and he describes classical Marxism as smelling like stale university coffee. But he says modern leftism smells like pumpkin spice lattes and suppressed maternal anxiety.
It is a highly specific, very evocative visual.
It really is. And he uses this to argue that modern leftism isn't actually about economics or class struggle anymore. He says it has morphed into a therapeutic grievance system.
Which is a major shift.
But I'm curious how he historically traces that shift. Because going from an economic workers' revolution to suppress maternal anxiety, that seems like a massive leap, right?
It is a massive leap, but what's fascinating here is the precise historical timeline Riker constructs to explain it. He points directly to the mid-20th century.
Specifically focusing on the Frankfurt School intellectuals, right? Exactly. And for listeners who might not be familiar with that term, the Frankfurt School refers to a group of scholars associated with the Institute for Social Research.
They were originally founded in Germany in the 1920s, right?
Yes. And they later fled to the United States and set up at Columbia University. We are talking about figures like Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, and Herbert Marcuse.
And what was their specific role in Riker's timeline? How do they fit into this pumpkin spice latte theory?
Well, according to Riker, these intellectuals faced a massive ideological crisis. Classical economic Marxism relied on the premise that the working class, the proletariat, would inevitably rise up and overthrow the capitalist system.
Right, the whole workers of the world unite thing.
Exactly. But in the comfortable, rapidly industrializing West, that revolution never materialized.
Because the working class was getting better wages.
Buying cars, moving to the suburbs, they were comfortable. So Riker argues these intellectuals had to pivot. If they couldn't foment an economic revolution, they had to foment a cultural one. Riker claims they performed what he calls a surgical graft. They took Marx's original critiques of economic power structures and meticulously sutured them onto psychology, the nuclear family, and cultural norms.
And he calls this the birth of critical theory, right?
Yes.
And here's where it gets really interesting for the listener. Because Riker claims this exact pivot was the moment leftism completely changed its fundamental nature.
It stopped being about material outcomes.
Right. It stopped being a demand for fair material outcomes, like a union demanding better hours in a factory. And it became this female-coded therapeutic system.
And in this newly engineered framework, the ultimate villain had to be swapped out.
Yes. It was no longer the wealthy bourgeois capitalist exploiting the worker. Instead, the new villain became the heterosexual white male.
Precisely. And if we connect this to the bigger picture Riker is painting, he actually traces the philosophical roots of this shift even further back from the Frankfurt School.
How far back?
He looks at the 18th century philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Oh.
Riker identifies Rousseau's concept of the noble savage as the intellectual cradle of modern leftism.
And just to clarify, the noble savage is essentially the myth that human beings are inherently pure and peaceful and good in their natural state.
Exactly. And that it is the structures of society, laws, and civilization that corrupt them.
So how does Rousseau's philosophy connect back to this idea of a therapeutic grievance system?
Riker argues that Rousseau's framework completely removes individual agency and accountability.
Because it's society's fault.
Right. If a person behaves badly or fails or commits a crime, the Rousseauian mindset dictates that it is not their fault, it is the fault of the system that corrupted them.
So Riker claims this ideology effectively treats adults like misbehaving toddlers who are in constant need of a maternal excuse.
It creates an environment where personal failings are outsourced to structural grievances. The institution is expected to act as an unconditionally forgiving mother, constantly adjusting its rules to accommodate emotional outbursts.
Rather than acting as a stern father enforcing objective boundaries. And that concept of the emotional outburst brings us to one of the most provocative psychological claims in the entire book. He scales this idea up to what he bluntly calls a borderline civilization.
He leans very heavily into clinical psychology here.
He really does.
No.
Riker cites clinical studies stating that borderline personality disorder, or BPD, is diagnosed 3 times more frequently in females than in males.
It is important to look at the specific traits of BPD that Riker isolates for this argument. Clinically, borderline personality disorder is characterized by extreme mood, swings of terror, of abandonment, and black and white thinking.
Which psychologists call splitting, right?
Right splitting. And profound emotional dysregulation. But perhaps most importantly for Riker's thesis, it involves emotional reasoning.
Emotional reasoning.
Yes, which is the cognitive distortion where a person concludes that their emotional reaction proves something is objectively true.
So if someone with BPD feels targeted, they believe it is an undeniable fact that they're being targeted, regardless of what the objective evidence actually shows.
Exactly. And Riker's central thesis in this section is that these specific clinical traits have been scaled up from the individual level to a civilizational level.
So he's saying society itself is acting like it has BPD.
Yes. He suggests that the phenomena we observe in modern digital culture, like viral hashtag mobs, cancel culture, and the rapid implementation of corporate equity policies, are not standard political strategies.
He frames them as clinical pathology, operating on a macro scale.
He describes our current society as one that is acting out a collective temper tantrum, where that tantrum is immediately validated and codified into policy by captured institutions under the banner of social justice.
Okay, so if Riker is arguing that this psychological shift has completely captured our cultural and academic institutions, I'm curious how he applies that theory to the actual dollars and cents of the economy.
It's a huge part of his argument.
Does he look at how this impacts the corporate world and the global market?
He spends a massive portion of the book doing exactly that. This transitions us into his analysis of what he terms the debt gender and the economics of emotion.
The debt gender. That is a heavy label.
It is. Riker presents a series of stark macroeconomic statistics to build his case here. He cites data indicating that women control approximately 85% of all consumer spending in the United States.
Okay, 85%.
However, he immediately juxtaposes that figure by stating that women account for 62% of personal bankruptcy filings.
Wow. And he also dives into the student loan crisis, too. He claims that women hold roughly two-thirds of all outstanding student debt.
And he doesn't just state the number, he aggressively critiques the nature of that debt.
Right, he attributes this massive financial burden to a systemic push toward what he calls useless degrees. He specifically points to fields like gender studies, sociology, or art therapy.
Arguing that these disciplines offer a negative return on investment and fail to generate tangible economic value.
And this disparity between consuming capital and producing capital is what Riker brands the Sephora Doctrine, right?
Yes, the Sephora Doctrine. It's his framework for describing a society that structurally prioritizes short-term consumerism over long-term production and innovation.
And to illustrate this, he draws a pretty sharp comparison. He looks at the global cosmetics and fast fashion industries, claiming they generate roughly $300 billion in annual revenue.
300 billion.
And he compares this consumer spending to what he notes is a mere $50 billion invested annually in private STEM research and development.
He is painting a picture of an economic system that is aggressively cannibalizing itself. He suggests society is burning through the hard infrastructure, the literal and financial capital built by previous generations of men.
Without doing the rigorous, unglamorous work required to replenish it.
Precisely.
But how does he explain the psychology behind this spending? Why is there such a drive toward this specific type of consumerism?
He connects this consumer behavior directly to a psychological mechanism he terms the estrogen consensus.
The estrogen consensus.
This is his concept of an ideological hive mind that governs modern social interaction. And to explain how this consensus enforces compliance, Riker references Solomon Asch's famous conformity experiments conducted in the 1950s.
Oh, the line length experiment. For our listeners who haven't taken Psychology 101 in a while, can you give a quick refresher on the Asch experiments?
Certainly. In Solomon Asch's experiments, a naive subject was placed in a room with a group of people who, unbeknownst to the subject, were all actors working for the experimenter.
Okay.
They were shown a simple line on a card and then asked to match its length to one of 3 lines on another card. It was an incredibly obvious visual task.
Like unmistakable.
Unmistakable. However, the actors were instructed to confidently give the wrong answer. Asch found that a significant percentage of the naive subjects would eventually conform to the group and knowingly give the incorrect answer.
Just simply to avoid the social discomfort of standing out or contradicting the majority.
Exactly. And Riker uses this to argue that today, the merit of an idea or the value of a trend is evaluated almost entirely by its emotional resonance and its level of social approval.
Rather than its objective truth or utility.
Yes. He points to phenomena on platforms like TikTok. He looks at viral trends like quiet quitting or the more recent de-influencing movement.
And he characterizes them as behavioral viruses.
He argues these trends are fundamentally fueled by a female-coded demand for social conformity and group validation.
This raises an important question within Riker's framework, though. How does this demand for emotional and economic validation interact with the modern state?
That is where Riker offers a fierce critique of the modern welfare state. He essentially characterizes the entirety of government social safety nets as daddy issues operating at a national scale.
That is a highly provocative framing, calling the welfare state daddy issues. How does he justify that?
He argues that this demographic treats the national treasury as an infinite consequence-free credit card. According to Riker, the modern state is expected to provide endless services, subsidies, and safety nets to cushion individuals from the harsh realities of life.
However, he points out a critical asymmetry in how these services are actually funded.
A massive asymmetry.
He claims that while the demands for state provision are driven by this maternalistic psychology, the actual capital required to fund it relies on immense targeted male productivity.
And he brings receipts for this claim. He cites labor and tax data stating that men pay 82% of all federal income taxes.
82%.
He notes that men work 83% of all recorded overtime hours, and perhaps most grimly, he points out that men suffer 90% of all occupational fatalities.
Wow. And he calls this the unspoken contract of the gynocentric state.
Let's examine how he defines that contract. Riker suggests that under this system, men are simultaneously treated as inherent predators who must be heavily tax regulated and socially managed,
while also being entirely relied upon to generate the tax base and maintain the physical infrastructure.
Conversely, he argues that the system treats women as vulnerable infants who must be perpetually protected, provided for, and shielded from the consequences of their own economic choices.
He also follows the money into the private sector. Where is all this disposable income actually going? Riker cites 2022 data from the Harvard Business Review analyzing the wellness industry.
The wellness industry is a fascinating case study for him.
It is. He notes that wellness has exploded into a $4.5 trillion global industry. And Riker aggressively critiques this sector, arguing that the vast majority of these purchases are just medically useless placebos.
Things like crystal healing aura readings, expensive essential oils, generalized wellness retreats.
Exactly. He argues this entire multi-trillion-dollar industry is fueled strictly by female anxiety. He coins the phrase self-absorption commodified to describe it.
And he traces this exact same logic of prioritizing feelings over objective reality directly into corporate America. Riker argues that these emotional imperatives are not just isolated to consumer habits.
They're actively destroying market efficiency and corporate competence.
He uses Salesforce as a primary example here. Riker points to reports that Salesforce spent roughly $3 million on what they termed equity adjustments
to close perceived gender pay gaps across the company.
Riker views this not as a victory for fairness, but as a dangerous prioritization of ideological narrative over actual market merit.
He goes even further with his corporate examples, bringing up Boeing, which obviously grabs your attention given their recent public struggles.
Boeing is a prime target for this analysis.
Riker alleges that Boeing's corporate culture shifted to prioritize diversity hires and internal inclusion metrics over raw engineering competence and rigorous safety protocols.
He directly links this ideological shift in human resources to the catastrophic mechanical failures and safety scandals the company has faced.
Riker defines this modern corporate push for equity as nothing more than envy dressed in bureaucratic language.
He argues it is a mechanism designed purely to confiscate the rewards of competence and redistribute them to satisfy an emotional demand for equality of outcome.
So having mapped out this economic and institutional capture, it naturally leads to the next major pillar of his thesis. If the economics are this heavily skewed, and if the corporate world is allegedly degrading its own competence to satisfy these emotional demands,
how is this entire system maintained?
Right, why isn't there mass organized rebellion against a framework that Riker claims is so demonstrably destructive?
And Riker has a very detailed answer for that. He argues it is maintained through rigorous, highly evolved psychological social control mechanisms.
He introduces a triad of social control that he refers to as GSR, which stands for gossip, shame, and rally.
To fully understand the GSR triad, we have to delve into the evolutionary psychology that Riker uses as his foundational premise here.
Okay, let's do that.
He explains that historically, in early tribal human societies, physical combat was rarely a viable or successful strategy for women to resolve disputes, secure resources, or compete for mates.
Because men possessed a clear physical advantage in direct violent confrontation.
Therefore, women had to evolve a different set of tools for survival. Reputation management became their primary survival capital.
Because in a tribal setting, if your reputation is destroyed, you are cast out of the group, which effectively means death.
Exactly. A damaged reputation could mean exile, the loss of male protection, or being cut off from communal resources. Therefore, according to Riker, the female brain became hyper-specialized in complex social surveillance.
Monitoring the hierarchy constantly.
Yes, evaluating the standing of peers and utilizing gossip to subtly enforce group norms, align alliances, and suppress rivals without ever resorting to physical violence.
And Riker's argument is that in our current digital age, social media platforms have taken this ancient tribal instinct and fully industrialized it.
He looks at modern phenomena like call-out culture and cancel culture.
And he frames these not as righteous grassroots activism striving for justice, but simply as this ancient mechanism of gossip that has been sanctified by woke dogma.
He has a quote in this section that really distills his view. He writes, "Accountability is just shame rebranded as justice. Solidarity is just rallying under an ideological banner."
Let's break down the mechanics of GSR as he describes it in action. First, the gossip.
The gossip phase is used to identify the target and spread the initial accusation, often based on a perceived violation of modern social norms.
Second, the shame.
The shame is the punitive phase, designed to socially isolate the target, threaten their employment, and destroy their reputation.
And finally, the rally.
The rally is the mobilization of the digital mob, creating the illusion of a massive consensus that forces institutions like employers or universities to capitulate and punish the target.
This entire process ties directly into a psychological concept he terms the responsibility evasion. And Riker gets into the neurology here.
He makes a very specific neurological claim, arguing that the female brain demonstrates heightened activity in the amygdala, which is the emotional processing center of the brain.
Right. And he argues that this heightened amygdala activity frequently overrides the prefrontal cortex, which is the area responsible for logic, objective analysis, and rational decision-making.
According to Riker's interpretation of this neurology, this dynamic makes internal feelings virtually indistinguishable from external objective facts.
To support this claim, he heavily cites a 2022 study published in the Journal of Behavioral Psychology. The study's findings, as presented by Riker, claim that women are 40% more likely than men to attribute their own personal failures or negative outcomes to external factors.
Rather than accepting personal responsibility.
He uses a rather stark, everyday hypothetical to illustrate how this plays out in real time. He asks the reader to imagine a scenario where a woman is distracted and rear-ends a man's car at a stoplight.
It is objectively her fault.
Exactly. However, according to Riker's hypothetical, she bursts into tears, becomes highly distressed, and claims the sun was in her eyes or she was overwhelmed by a personal issue.
Riker argues that the societal conditioning is so strong that the man she hit will often find himself apologizing to her and trying to soothe her distress.
Completely invoking the reality of who is responsible for the accident. He argues this evasion of responsibility, when scaled up, is a cultural poison.
And this evasion directly fuels what Riker identifies as the language war. He argues that the modern left actively and intentionally redefines words to control the boundaries of reality.
The most potent weapon in this language war, he claims, is the subtle shift in rhetoric from objective statements like "I think that" to subjective emotional shields like "I feel like."
Right. If I say, I think your policy is wrong, we can debate the facts.
But if I say I feel unsafe because of your policy, the debate changes entirely.
Because you cannot objectively disprove how someone feels. The subjective feeling becomes an impenetrable shield. If you attempt to argue against or dismiss how someone feels, you are no longer just having a disagreement.
According to modern progressive framing, you are committing an act of invalidation, or even a form of linguistic violence.
And he provides specific institutional examples of how this manipulation of language has profound real-world consequences. Let's look at his critique of the Duluth model.
For listeners who might not be familiar, the Duluth model is a framework developed in the 1980s that became the standard protocol for how many police departments and social services handle domestic violence calls.
Riker attacks the Duluth model aggressively. He argues that the policy is inherently ideologically captured.
According to his analysis of the model, it operates on a default assumption that domestic violence is an expression of patriarchal control.
Therefore, Riker claims it automatically treats men as the perpetrators and women as the victims by default, almost regardless of the immediate context of the altercation.
He points out that this policy remains in place despite decades of criminological data, demonstrating that reciprocal violence where both partners are physically aggressive is highly common in domestic disputes.
He describes this as a clear example of feminist ideological doctrine legally overriding empirical reality.
He also points to higher education to show this dynamic in action. He brings up the infamous 2017 protests at Evergreen State College.
During these protests, progressive student groups demanded a day of racial segregation on campus and aggressively confronted dissenting faculty members, eventually forcing a professor to resign.
Riker characterizes the students' rhetoric during these protests, constantly citing that they felt unsafe due to intellectual disagreement as pure maternal hysteria.
He argues they were effectively demanding that logic, due process, and open debate be completely sacrificed to maintain the emotional comfort.
He finds a similar pattern in his analysis of Title IX's adjudications on college campuses. He specifically highlights a well-known 2014 Columbia University Title IX case.
Riker argues that the university's response demonstrated how an accusation alone, driven by a claim of emotional trauma, was sufficient to trigger severe punitive measures against a male student.
Despite what Riker claims was a glaring lack of objective evidence and a complete denial of basic due process rights, he uses this to illustrate how weaponized victimhood operates as an unassailable currency in academia.
And Riker argues that this systemic institutional bias reaches its absolute zenith in the family court system.
Oh, the family courts. He presents a series of statistics to paint a grim picture of modern marriage and divorce. He states that women initiate roughly 70% of all divorces in the United States.
However, despite initiating the dissolution of the marriage, he notes that they receive primary custody of the children approximately 85% of the time.
Riker distills this dynamic into a phrase he calls emotional socialism.
Emotional socialism. The argument he makes is that the legal system essentially privatizes all the rewards for women, awarding them the marital assets, the primary residence, and the children, often simply because they cite feelings of unhappiness or a lack of fulfillment.
Meanwhile, he argues the system socializes all the risks and the severe financial costs onto the men who are frequently displaced from their homes, alienated from their children, and left legally obligated to pay years of alimony and child support.
That phrase, emotional socialism, is a powerful rhetorical tool that really captures the essence of his economic and social critique. He argues that the system is designed to subsidize female emotional volatility using male labor.
But here is where the book takes an even darker turn. Riker argues that the ultimate casualty of all this all this emotional socialism isn't just men's wallets or their reputations or their access to their children.
He argues the ultimate casualty is the very survival of the species.
This brings us to his dire warnings concerning demographic collapse and what he dedicates an entire chapter to the testosterone drought.
Riker points out an undeniable global trend. Birth rates are collapsing across the entirety of the developed Western world. He uses Iceland as his primary case study.
Iceland is frequently championed as one of the most progressive nations on Earth, proudly boasting about its high levels of gender equality and robust social safety nets.
Yet Riker points out Iceland has a birth rate of 1.7 children per woman, which is significantly below the population replacement level of 2.1.
He places the blame for this impending demographic winter squarely on a cultural phenomenon he calls the fantasy industrial complex.
He argues that modern women have been subjected to decades of intense cultural conditioning that teaches them to prioritize career status, personal autonomy, and self-actualization over family formation.
Furthermore, he links this to what evolutionary psychologists call hypergamy.
Let's define hypergamy for the listener. In evolutionary psychology, hypergamy refers to the deeply ingrained instinct observed primarily in females across many species to mate across and up the social and dominance hierarchy.
It is the drive to secure a mate who possesses greater resources status or physical prowess than themselves.
And Riker applies this concept directly to modern dating apps like Tinder or Bumble. He notes that the data from these apps shows a stark reality.
Women are fiercely competing for the attention of only the top 10 to 20% of men, the men who represent the apex of physical attractiveness, wealth, and status.
Consequently, they are algorithmically rating roughly 80% of men as below average and effectively invisible.
Riker argues that by incessantly chasing this illusory, perfectly curated life of high career status, combined with a top-tier, statistically rare partner, modern women are actually, if perhaps unconsciously, choosing to abandon motherhood entirely.
He has a very stark line summarizing this phenomenon. He writes that modern women have been gaslit into believing they can have it all, but that all has been tragically redefined.
He says it now simply means a sterile, meticulously decorated apartment, a therapist on speed dial, a cabinet full of SSRIs, and a future where their genetic lineage dies with them.
And while women are allegedly distracted chasing this culturally engineered fantasy, Riker asserts that men are being systematically and biologically weakened.
This is the core focus of Chapter 18, titled The Testosterone Drought. Riker relies heavily on clinical data here, specifically pointing to a major 2021 study published in the JAMA Network Open.
Let's dig into that study because it forms the biological foundation of his argument. What exactly did the JAMA study find?
The study measured serum testosterone levels in adult and adolescent males over an extended period. The findings, as Riker highlights, are alarming.
The data indicates that average testosterone levels in Western men have plummeted by over 20% in just the last 2 decades.
Furthermore, this is not just an issue of older men aging. The decline is observed across all age cohorts, including teenagers and men in their 20s.
Riker doesn't just present the data, he posits a chilling theory as to why this is happening. He hypothesizes that the modern left and the institutions they control intentionally pathologize traditional masculinity to engineer a more compliant populace.
Let's examine the endocrinological logic he uses to build this theory. Testosterone is the primary hormone associated with drive, aggression, competitiveness, and physical strength.
Endocrinologically speaking, low testosterone levels heavily correlate with increased risk aversion, higher levels of passivity, emotional fragility, and a greater willingness to submit to external authority.
So by Riker's logic, a society populated by men with plummeting testosterone is a society that is vastly easier to manage.
A populace that lacks the biological drive to compete or resist is much easier for a centralized maternalistic state to govern and extract resources from. He explicitly calls this process literal chemical castration.
And he traces the origins of this process back to early childhood education. Riker argues that the biological suppression of males begins the moment they enter the public school system.
He points to the staggering disparity in how behavioral medications are prescribed. He notes that young boys are diagnosed with ADHD and prescribed powerful stimulant medications such as Ritalin or Adderall at more than twice the rate of young girls.
He argues that this massive discrepancy is not driven by an epidemic of medical necessity, but rather by a desperate need for disciplinary control.
Boys naturally possess high levels of rambunctious physical energy. But Riker argues that modern classrooms have been entirely female-coded.
They prioritize sitting still, being quiet, collaborative circle time, and emotional sharing.
In this environment, the natural physical energy of boys is viewed not as a trait to be channeled or developed, but strictly as an inconvenience or a pathology that must be medicated away to force compliance.
The anecdotes he uses to illustrate this systemic intolerance of male behavior are striking. He recounts a widely reported incident where a 6-year-old boy was suspended from elementary school under a zero-tolerance policy.
Simply for chewing a breakfast Pop-Tart into the vague shape of a gun and pointing it.
Riker uses that absurdity to highlight a massive double standard. He contrasts the hysterical, punitive overreaction to a boy merely simulating a symbol of violence with how those same schools handle the behavior of girls.
He argues that schools routinely ignore or downplay the devastating psychological bullying, the intricate gossip networks, and the vicious social exclusion that constitute the preferred warfare of young girls.
His point is that overt physicality is punished instantly and severely, while covert psychological cruelty is largely overlooked because it is the female default.
And what, according to Riker, is the macro-level result of raising boys in an environment that constantly pathologizes their very nature.
He points to the catastrophic collapse of male achievement across society. He notes the widening education gap, citing statistics that boys are now 30% less likely to enroll in a 4-year college than girls.
And the statistics get even darker when you look at where boys are overrepresented. They utterly dominate the statistics for high school dropouts. They make up the vast majority of the expanding prison populations, and tragically, they account for roughly 80% of all completed suicides.
Riker is arguing that we have engineered a cultural and institutional desert. Men are actively discouraged from taking risks, from competing aggressively, from protecting traditional boundaries.
They are constantly instructed to be vulnerable, to be soft, to deconstruct their masculinity.
Yet, simultaneously, society still secretly and totally relies upon them to build the roads, maintain the power grid, and fund the tax base.
So having diagnosed what he sees as a terminal, multifaceted illness infecting Western civilization spanning economic psychology and biology, Riker pivots in his final chapter to the cure.
This final section is what he outlines as the red pill prescription.
I found this section particularly interesting because of what he explicitly tells his readers not to do. He tells his audience that retreating to a cabin in the woods or going off the grid is not a viable or honorable option.
He argues that civilization, the infrastructure our ancestors built, cannot be saved by abandoning it to the people currently dismantling it.
He demands deliberate, intellectually rigorous, and cultural action to rebuild the individual first, which will consequently rebuild society.
And the primary tool he advocates for this rebuilding process is a return to classical education. He doesn't offer trite political advice like go protest or vote for this specific candidate in the next midterm.
Instead, he instructs his readers to master the trivium.
For those who might not be familiar with classical education models, can you explain what the trivium is and why Riker views it as the ultimate weapon?
The trivium is an ancient classical educational framework consisting of 3 fundamental stages of learning grammar, logic, and rhetoric.
It was the foundation of education in antiquity and the Middle Ages, designed to teach a student not just what to think, but how to think.
Riker frames this ancient model as the ultimate red pill operating system, specifically designed to cut through and completely dismantle the emotional manipulation of the modern era.
Let's break down exactly how he applies each step of the trivium to modern cultural warfare. First, grammar. How does he define grammar in this context?
In Riker's application, grammar is not about memorizing sentence structure or punctuation rules. It is about understanding the foundational code and the precise definitions underneath the propaganda.
It is the ability to dissect language.
By mastering grammar, Riker argues you can identify and expose weaponized terms. For example, he points to the phrase toxic masculinity.
Through the lens of grammar, one recognizes that this is an oxymoron designed strictly to pathologize inherent male strength.
Similarly, you learn to recognize that modern terms like my truth or lived experience are not legitimate epistemological concepts, but rather rhetorical shields used to deflect the scrutiny of objective truth.
Okay, so grammar defines the terms. Next is logic. Riker describes logic as the scalpel that dissects the emotional tumor.
Exactly. Logic is the rigorous process of demanding evidence and identifying fallacies. It is the refusal to accept an argument based on emotion.
Let's look at a hypothetical application. When a modern institution claims that the gender pay gap is purely the result of systemic patriarchal oppression, the trivium-trained mind applies logic.
Logic demands that you look beyond the emotional claim and analyze the multivariate data. It forces you to account for differing choices in college majors, the disparity in hours worked per week, the willingness to take on hazardous occupational roles, and the continuity of time in the workforce.
Logic destroys the fragile house of cards built on emotional appeals, cherry-picked statistics, and circular reasoning.
And finally, rhetoric. Riker makes a crucial point here. Rhetoric is the delivery system.
He warns his readers that it absolutely does not matter if you possess all the objective facts, the most accurate data, and flawless logic if you cannot persuade anyone to listen to you.
Riker urges his audience to master rhetoric so they can frame the truth, compellingly speak with unshakable confidence, and dismantle emotional arguments publicly without losing their composure.
Beyond the strict mechanics of the trivium, Riker also urges a philosophical return to what classical thinkers called the transcendentals. The transcendentals are three objective universal ideals: truth, goodness, and beauty.
Why does he focus on those three specific concepts?
Riker argues that the modern progressive left inherently disguises these concepts precisely because they represent objective, immovable standards.
The left, he claims, relies on a framework of total subjectivity and moral relativism, where personal internal feelings are elevated above verifiable external facts.
In their framework, classical standards of architectural or physical beauty must be aggressively deconstructed or labeled as oppressive because an objective standard of beauty implies a hierarchy.
And a hierarchy implies that some things are objectively better than others. Riker tells his readers they must actively pursue, embody, and aggressively defend these objective standards of truth, goodness, and beauty in their own lives.
He also gets very specific with his demands for institutional and educational reform. He outlines a vision that is essentially a complete reversal of the last 50 years of educational theory.
He says society needs to completely defund and dismantle the therapeutic, HR-driven bureaucracy that has infected public schools and universities.
He advocates for a return to rigorous merit-based education. He calls for the massive expansion of trade schools and hard skill acquisition.
For young boys, he explicitly recommends mandatory involvement in combat sports like wrestling or jiu-jitsu to properly channel their aggression and teach them physical discipline and respect for hierarchy.
He also wants to absolutely obliterate the modern self-esteem culture. He despises the era of participation trophies.
Instead of unwarranted praise, he advocates for an environment of earned respect. He uses a fantastic phrase here. He says, young men must experience the visceral, clarifying sting of not being good enough.
He firmly believes that experiencing failure and the appropriate social shame associated with falling short of an objective standard is the only crucible that can build true resilience and eventual excellence.
Finally, Riker makes a passionate call for deep philosophical and historical literacy. He instructs his readers to immerse themselves in foundational texts.
He specifically points to the political philosophy of John Locke, the stoicism of Marcus Aurelius, and the harrowing historical accounts of Alexander Solzhenitsyn.
What is his specific rationale for recommending those authors?
Riker argues that a man who deeply understands history and foundational philosophy develops intellectual antibodies. These antibodies make him immune to the emotional blackmail of modern politics.
When a historically literate man sees corporate or government policies demanding forced equity of outcomes, he instantly recognizes the historical parallels to the failed, murderous collectivist states of the 20th century.
He understands the architecture of tyranny, even when that tyranny is presented with a compassionate, soft, maternal smile.
Okay, let's take a deep breath and zoom out. We have covered an immense almost dizzying amount of ground today.
We've traced a line from the Frankfurt School intellectuals of the mid-20th century all the way to the psychology behind pumpkin spice lattes.
We've unpacked the Sephora doctrine, analyzed the plummeting testosterone rates in Western men, examined the evolutionary purpose of gossip, and ended with a crash course in the classical trivium.
This book, BPD, Limerence, and Chaos, is an incredibly dense, sweeping attempt to weave evolutionary psychology, global macroeconomic trends, human endocrinology, and cultural Marxism into one single unified theory explaining the decline of Western civilization.
It is undeniably a vast, complex, and deeply controversial scope. And to reiterate our stance from the very beginning of this deep dive, our purpose here today has been solely to lay out Conrad Riker's arguments precisely as he wrote them.
The source material is highly polarizing.
Yeah.
Our goal as your hosts is not to validate his statistics or to invalidate his historical claims.
Our job has been to provide you with the comprehensive architecture of his thought process to explain the mechanics of how he connects these disparate fields so that you can evaluate these highly charged arguments for yourself.
Exactly. We want to give you the intellectual tools, the detailed breakdown necessary to truly understand the discourse surrounding this book. Now, before we wrap up today's deep dive, I need to remind you one more time, please hit that like button right now and subscribe to the show so you never miss a deep dive.
If this breakdown of Riker's theories has piqued your interest, we explicitly urge you to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to purchase a copy of BPD, Limerence, and Chaos and read the full text for yourself.
And of course, don't forget to follow the author at Conrad Riker on his Substack to keep up with his latest essays and writings.
To close out today's deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own as you consider the material we've covered.
Riker's fundamental overarching argument is that prioritizing emotional safety and subjective feelings over harsh objective truth inevitably and historically leads to the collapse of a functioning society.
Regardless of where you stand on his specific views regarding gender roles or his critiques of the welfare state or his political targets, his framework forces us to ask a profound existential question.
What exactly happens to a democracy when its fundamental language shifts permanently from what can we prove to how does this make us feel?
Can a society that decides to govern itself primarily by the dictates of subjective emotion ever hope to sustain a system of objective justice?
It is a question that cuts to the very core of how we structure our civilization and our future.
It is a heavy question, and it's one you will ultimately have to answer for yourself.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and we will see you next time.